The American Civil War was the deadliest conflict in U.S. history. And I mean, it claimed more American lives than World War I and World War II combined. So the question is, how? How did a nation founded on these grand principles of liberty and equality end up fighting such a brutal war against itself? Well, in this explainer, we're going to dig into the complex causes of the conflict, see how it all unfolded, and explore the legacy it left on the United States, a legacy we're still grappling with today.
Back in 1858, a full 2 years before he even became president, Abraham Lincoln pretty much nailed the problem. He gave this speech and said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Now, that wasn't just some clever line. He was stating a cold, hard fact. The United States just couldn't go on forever being half slave and half free. Those words perfectly captured the deep, fundamental crack that was splitting the country right down the middle.
Because really, by the middle of the 19th century, the United States was, in a lot of ways, two completely different countries just sharing a border. You had the North, this bustling industrial society, and then you had the South, a rural farming economy that was completely built on the institution of slavery. These weren't just small differences. They created this huge chasm between the two regions, and it was getting harder and harder to imagine how they could coexist.
Yeah, just look at this comparison. You can practically see the two Americas on a collision course. The North's economy, it's all about factories, a growing workforce of immigrants, creating this really dynamic urban society. But the South's economy, well, it was all about agriculture, especially cotton. And it was totally 100% dependent on the labor of 4 million enslaved people. This huge economic gap created a power struggle that was just bound to explode.
So as the nation starts pushing west, this division just creates nonstop political drama. The big question was always the same. When we get these new territories, are they going to be free states or slave states? And look, this wasn't just some high-minded moral debate. No, this was a raw fight for political power. Every new state could tip the balance in Congress. So for both the North and the South, it felt like a zero-sum game they couldn't afford to lose. For decades, Congress just tried to slap a Band-Aid on the problem. They came up with a whole series of political deals. You had the Missouri Compromise, which basically drew a line across the country, separating future slave and free states. Then came the Compromise of 1850, this whole complicated package of laws designed to try and keep both sides happy. But really, what were these? They were temporary fixes. They were just kicking the can down the road, never actually solving the core issue of slavery. And then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This was the compromise that finally blew everything up. It allowed settlers in new territories to just vote on whether or not to allow slavery. They called it popular sovereignty. Well, in Kansas, this turned politics into a literal battlefield. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into the territory trying to sway the vote. And the result? It was a brutal, small-scale civil war that got the name Bleeding Kansas, a terrifying preview of what was about to happen to the entire nation. Okay, so by the late 1850s, the whole political system is just teetering on the edge of collapse. The old political parties had totally fractured over the issue of slavery. And out of that chaos, a new force emerged, the Republican Party. And their main platform was simple: stop slavery from expanding into the Western territories. This set the stage for a presidential election that was going to shatter the Union for good. So in 1860, Abraham Lincoln gets elected president without winning a single Southern state. Now, he promised he wouldn't interfere with slavery where it already existed, but that didn't matter. To the South, his victory on a platform of stopping slavery's expansion was basically a declaration of war on their entire way of life. They saw it as an existential threat. So what happened? South Carolina seceded almost immediately, and 6 other states followed right behind them, forming the Confederacy. The whole standoff finally came to a head at Fort Sumter, a federal fort sitting right in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The new Confederacy demanded the fort surrender, but the Union refused. So the shore batteries opened fire. After 34 hours of bombardment, the Union garrison surrendered. And that was it. The first shots had been fired. The war that had been brewing for decades was finally here. Now, it's interesting. At the beginning of the war, the North's official goal was just to preserve the Union. It wasn't about ending slavery. But as the conflict dragged on and the body count just kept climbing higher and higher, the moral need for emancipation became impossible to ignore. The sheer brutality of this war was about to force a massive change in what it was all about. And if you want to understand the shocking cost of this war, just look at the Battle of Antietam. On one day, September 17, 1862, 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or went missing. 23,000. It was and still is the single bloodiest day in American history. That scale of slaughter just stunned the nation, and it gave President Lincoln the strategic moment he needed to change the entire course of the war.
Just 5 days after that horrific battle, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It was a game changer. It declared that all enslaved people in the states that were in rebellion would be freed. This was a pivotal moment. The proclamation completely transformed the war. It was no longer just a fight to save the old nation. It was now a moral crusade to create a new nation, one where freedom wasn't limited by the color of your skin.
The Emancipation Proclamation also did something else huge. It officially opened the door for Black men to enlist, and they did. Nearly 200,000 served in the Union Army and Navy. They fought with incredible courage, even though they often faced discrimination, like getting unequal pay. But despite all those challenges, their contribution to the war effort was absolutely vital, and their service was a powerful step in fighting for their own liberation. So after 4 long, bloody years, the Confederacy finally surrendered in the spring of 1865. The Civil War was a truly transformative event. I mean, it preserved the Union and it abolished slavery, but it also left these deep, deep scars that would take generations to heal, and it left behind a whole new set of questions for the nation to answer. The outcomes of the war were just monumental. The nation was saved, and the 13th Amendment made slavery unconstitutional forever. But the cost was staggering. Over 620,000 soldiers were dead. The South's entire economy was in ruins. And the country was left with this enormous challenge of not just rebuilding, but figuring out what freedom really meant for millions of newly emancipated citizens. So in the end, the Civil War answered one huge question. Yes, the United States would survive as one nation. But it left us with a new, even more profound question, one we're still wrestling with today. What does it truly mean to be free and equal in America? The war's legacy, you see, continues to shape that American story.